Just a couple hours ago, Matthew McConaughey in a role you have never seen him in before. Advocate in the White House, pushing Congress to do something on gun reform, begging for something to change after that massacre at an elementary school in his hometown of Uvalde. So what's Congress going to do now? And in tonight's original, I talk with a man who is the principal at Columbine High School, the day 2 students there shot and killed 13 people, about how he's created a network for healing after such horror. That's coming up later in the show. Plus, it is primary day in 7 states, so we break down the biggest races and the biggest issues, including that big money, big name California contest for mayor. Plus, stop me if you heard this one before. Another day, another record high for gas prices. We are now close to a national average of $5 a gallon. You probably are feeling that. And near record inflation, too, with the Treasury Secretary saying it's unacceptable. So what does that mean for you as we head into summer? And speaking of summer, it may get a little trickier to fly out to your next vacation, with some airlines grounding planes over a pilot shortage that a pilots union says doesn't exist. All right, we got your reality check on that coming up later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we're coming on the air with an intense moment at the White House today. Matthew McConaughey at the podium in the briefing room, all but begging Washington to do something on guns. Remember, before McConaughey was an Oscar winner, he grew up in Uvalde. He says it's where he learned how to shoot a gun. And at points, he could barely choke out his words, telling the stories of the teachers and children who lost their lives at Robb Elementary School, the families he met when he was there. Here he is talking about 10-year-old Maite Rodriguez.
Maite wore green high-top Converse with a heart she had hand-drawn on the right toe because they represented her love of nature. Camilla's got these shoes. Can you show these shoes, please? Wore these every day. Green Converse with a heart on the right toe. These are the same green Converse on her feet that turned out to be the only clear evidence that could identify her after the shooting. How about that?
It comes on the same day that members of Congress are coming face to face with families who lost the people they love to gun violence, to recent mass shootings. The first of 2 days of hearings with relatives who saw their parents, their siblings, their friends taken from them, explaining what life is like now without them, hoping it's a wake-up call for change. One of those witnesses today, Garnell Whitfield Jr., his mother, shot and killed at the Tops grocery store in Buffalo just a few weeks ago.
My mother's life mattered. My mother's life mattered. And your actions here today will tell us how much it matters to you.
Tomorrow, members of the House are bracing for another gut-wrenching hearing, when those testifying will include 11-year-old Mia Cerrillo, who survived the Uvalde shooting by smearing herself in her classmates' blood and playing dead to stay alive. Joining me now are Carol Lee and Ali Vitale. Carol, I'll start with you at the White House and this. It was a moment from Matthew McConaughey there at the White House podium, a moment that seems to have broken through in a way that perhaps other White House briefings have not, with that star power, with that personal connection to his hometown in Uvalde. Talk a little bit about what it was like in that briefing room and the impact on this longer term.
It was a moment, Hallie, and, you know, typically when celebrities come into the White House briefing room, it's something very lighthearted. It's not like what we saw today. You could hear a pin drop in the room as Matthew McConaughey was speaking. He made a very impassioned plea for Congress to do something. And he even talked about how his mom used to teach at a school about a mile from Robb Elementary School. So clearly this is something that's very personal to him. He went and he and his family met with families of the victims. You heard him talk about the little girl with the green high-top sneakers. There were others that he talked about. And he also talked about things that he wants Congress to do, very specific things, including some of which that are unlikely to get passed, but some that might get passed. Take a listen.
We need responsible gun ownership. Responsible gun ownership. We need background checks. We need to raise the minimum age to purchase an AR-15 rifle to 21. We need a waiting period for those rifles. We need red flag laws and consequences for those who abuse them.
So some of those things, red flag laws, expanded background checks, those are things that have potential to pass in Congress, not to the extent that someone like Matthew McConaughey or even President Biden and other Democrats would like. But there could be some measures along those lines. The other things that he talked about, for instance, raising the minimum age on assault-style weapons, that's not something that's expected to pass, but a very impassioned plea in the White House briefing room today, Hallie.
And this is coming from a celebrity whose political leanings, as we've talked about, gosh, even in the last 8 months on this show, are not immediately obvious, right? Somebody who flirted with running for governor, reportedly. We talked about that. Didn't know if he'd be a Democratic or a Republican candidate here. There are a lot of voices speaking out for changes to the nation's gun laws. And yet, to this point, Carol, those voices have not been able to see the kind of change they want to see from members of Congress. Why would today, if it is any different, be any different?
Well, one of the things that Matthew McConaughey talked about, and we've heard others talk about, is that this moment is somehow different, that there is a moment where there's an opportunity here where lawmakers can try to thread the needle that they've been unable to thread for a really long time and pass something. That's something that he hit on numerous times. Take a listen to that.
I'm here today in the hopes of applying what energy, reason, and passion that I have into trying to turn this moment into a reality. Because as I said, this moment is different. We are in a window of opportunity right now that we have not been in before. A window where it seems like real change can happen.
So one of the things that we've seen is obviously Matthew McConaughey's appearance in the White House briefing room is getting a lot of attention. That fading attention is something that's been the enemy of anything getting done in Congress, that if you don't keep up that pressure, that attention, that momentum, that the lawmakers won't actually act. And so I think part of the hope here is that that momentum continues and something may get done.
Carol Lee, live for us outside the White House. Carol, thank you. Let me turn to Hallie now, who covers Congress for us. Hallie, give us the reality check then, right? And we've been talking about it for a while, but these conversations have been going on with Senator Chris Murphy, who, by the way, our cameras caught a shot of him heading to the White House today to speak with President Biden, to update him on how these conversations are going, that he's conducting with, for example, Senator John Cornyn, one of the top Republicans in the Senate, and others. So as we speak, Tuesday early evening, where do things stand?
Well, look, the fact that there are meetings to have updates on and that Murphy is going to the White House and talking to Biden about where things stand shows there's still a chance here. Again, you and I have said this. This is a building, Congress, that doesn't have a large well of reserve for optimism, especially at moments like these where many lawmakers have even cautioned. They've seen this film before and they've seen these kinds of talks break down. There are, though, a few key signs of maybe that this time is different, potentially because Senator Mitch McConnell has blessed these bipartisan conversations, potentially because there's a pressure being kept on by advocacy groups, by people like McConaughey entering the conversation, by these kinds of hearings that we're seeing on the Hill that are so gut-wrenching and so passionate from people who have had their lives completely upended in the last 2 weeks because of gun violence. Maybe all of those things lend to making this moment different. I will also say, and you've covered negotiations like this before too, you know that if you're swimming in details from people who are talking on background, not using their names, that negotiations probably aren't going too well. The fact that we have so little of that right now is something that multiple sources and lawmakers have pointed out to me as a sign that there could be something real being negotiated here. They say by the end of the week. There's no real timeline, but that's when we could start seeing some details.
Or at least some clarity. And Hallie, what is the most likely thing when you talk about concrete things? What is the most likely thing? It seems to me, and you know better than I do as you're working your sources on the Hill, that it's the incentivization to states to do things like strengthen red flag laws, et cetera. Less so, for example, something that Matthew McConaughey called for, which is changing the age where you can buy an assault weapon from 18 to 21.
Though there is a little bit of new appetite around that one provision, not in the numbers that they would need. Obviously, we're counting to 60 or more than 60 here in terms of what could actually pass the Senate. But there are some people who are showing openness to raising that age limit. What's actually concrete in these conversations, though, of what could be in this Senate package are, yes, you say incentivizing red flag laws across the country. That's definitely something that's always been in this conversation as we've been talking to our sources. So has mental health. I was talking with another Republican senator today who was pointing to a bill that he has with a Democratic senator that he thinks could be a nice fix for this. So you're seeing Republicans sort of raise their hands and say, all right, if you want to fill this policy bucket of mental health and school safety, here's a way to do it. There are people who are showing signs of engagement. Again, it's just a question of if engagement comes in the form of 60+ votes that are actually needed to pass. That is the entire ballgame here, Hallie, for these negotiators and for the larger body of Congress.
Hallie Vitale live for us on the Hill. Hallie, thank you. So as lawmakers work to figure out maybe some kind of an agreement on the nation's gun laws, California voters in two pretty progressive cities are taking the issue of violent crime directly to the ballot box today. Just within the last hour or so, we've got these live pictures of California Congresswoman Karen Bass voting in the L.A. primary for mayor, presumably voting for herself, right? She's on the ballot, considered a rising star in the Democratic Party. But interestingly, that race is absolutely drowning in cash, mostly because of the person she's up against. Ex-Republican billionaire turned Democrat Rick Caruso. That's him. We're going to talk about him in a second. But let me tell you what Congresswoman Bass told our team right as she finished casting her ballot. Watch.
Your opponent has spent a lot of money in this race.
Yes, he has.
$40 million to your $3 million. Can you tell me, I mean, where do you feel like you're at in comparison with him at this point?
Well, neck and neck. As a matter of fact, according to the polls, I'm a couple of points ahead, which I think just says that Angelenos understand the difference, and I don't believe that City Hall is up for sale.
So you heard those numbers. Did you catch them right at the top? Caruso has spent something like $40 million, more than 10 times what Bass has spent. And this is a race that has divided the Hollywood stars out in L.A. For Karen Bass, you have, well, not a Hollywood star, but maybe a Washington star, Nancy Pelosi. But you also have Magic Johnson, Emily's List, the L.A. Times editorial board. For Rick, I think Ariana Grande, actually, too. For Rick Caruso, you have Snoop Dogg, Kim Kardashian, Kris Jenner, Gwyneth Paltrow, Maria Shriver. Then you've got what's happening further north in San Francisco, where violent crime is up, and prevention has been at the center of the city's priorities there. Voters are trying to figure out whether they're going to recall their top prosecutor, who's been the face of this progressive prosecutor movement, or not. Joining me now is the person you saw in that interview with Congresswoman Bass, Steve Patterson. Steve, I understand you're posted up outside the place where Rick Caruso is expected to be voting. I see you looking over your shoulder. If he walks out, please go let us know and talk with him. But you've been covering this L.A. mayor's race, which, by the way, the reason why it's interesting on the national level is because in many ways experts see this as kind of a microcosm of the sort of progressive versus more law and order centrist movement that is happening in places all across the country.
That's exactly right. You know, this is a microcosm because this is happening in so many cities across the country. A lot of cities dealing with the same sort of things post-COVID, especially when you're talking about law and order and crime, but also in this city. I mean, my gosh, the homelessness is really pervasive here. Anywhere from 40 to 50,000 people on the street unhoused. And then you add on top of that, you're paying $6 for gas here. You can't find a home here. There are a lot of issues that are pulling people apart when it comes to how they feel about the direction that they feel this city needs to go in, with the fact that this is a 60% electorate for the Democrats. So it's like pick your flavor of Democrats. And Hallie, we must have some sort of magic because the same thing is happening again. Rick Caruso is down here. He just got out of his car. He will be walking this way, I assume, in the next few minutes. So if we have an opportunity, we will show him. I cannot talk to him where I'm stationed right now because we are within that 100 feet. So I'm literally not allowed to ask him a question, although if we can bounce him back out, I will talk to him. And part of the question I would ask him is about his spending. I mean, he's been accused from his opponents, including Karen Bass, of really buying his way into this race. And, you know, he's been known here as something of a kingmaker, somebody that has kind of worked in the background of politics. The problem is working in the background for Republicans and independents and Democrats. Nobody really has a good sense of where he's been at over the last 10 or so years, but now registered Democrat, really just within the first few weeks of announcing his run for mayor, and he's really blitzed this campaign. I mean, Karen Bass was way out ahead of everybody else at the early stages. The entirety of the Democratic Party solidified behind her. She, you know, has obviously been in this area for decades as a reformer, as a political insider. here is somebody that has worked across the aisle, and she had a big lead. And now here comes Rick Caruso, a guy that spent $40 million. His advertising is everywhere. His message is everywhere. Yeah. Really running sort of that Obama change campaign type thing. As you see him walking toward it, he'll start to come this way. And I'll step aside actually just to show you as he comes back. But, you know, just really telling voters that he's different, that he's somebody that is not the same that really this city has seen for years and years. This one party in the state of California and in the city of LA. And I think people have said to me, at least, that they are ready for a change, Hallie.
You know, it's interesting. One of the pieces that I'd read about this, I think it was either Politico or the LA Times, talked about how Caruso's what they described as sparkling vision for Los Angeles is appealing to people because of the many people in LA experiencing homelessness. That has become a major issue at the center of this campaign, Steve.
Not only homelessness, but on the complete other side of that. I mean, how many people have been to the Grove, right? The Grove Mall, the Americana. These are classic LA places that he has developed and built, and millions of people, more people go to those places than they go to Disneyland. More people are familiar and at home with those places than a place like Disneyland. And he's built that feeling in order to try to spread that out throughout his mayoral campaign. And he wants to deliver that almost the same sort of messaging when it comes to the homeless. His plan is to get people off the street immediately. He wants to remove at least 30,000 as soon as he gets in office within his first term, and then bring in the mental help, and then bring in sort of the social workers to try to help that situation. But his first plan is to clean everything up, and he has the same sort of messaging that he does with his developments, Hallie. It's very unique to hear from a candidate. Back to you.
Steve Patterson, I would say goodbye, but I feel like this is just bye-bye for now. Stay close to your camera, because if you do get Rick Caruso after I finish talking with Chuck, we obviously would love to hear a little bit from him, given the stakes of this race. So Chuck Todd, as I previewed, is here to join us to break down some of those Cali races and some others to watch across the country, fresh off of his own show here on NBC News Now, launching this week. So Chuck, let me start with California here, because there's this interesting umbrella of like a law and order theme, if you will, right? You heard about it with Rick Caruso, with Karen Bass. You're seeing it in San Francisco with this prosecutor recall. You saw it, I think, back to New York, right? Mayor Eric Adams, that was a key thing that he ran on too. How do you see this politically for the Democratic Party playing out, especially when it comes to the leader of the party, and that's President Biden?
Well, in some ways, it's what we saw. It's why President Biden got the Democratic nomination, is that he came from the supposed moderate wing. He came from the fund the police wing of the party, not the defund the police wing of the party, to be a bit crass about it, if you will, in trying to talk about this divide. You know, watching L.A., I feel like I've seen this exact same mayor's race. It was the first mayor's race I covered professionally after the '92 elections, and it was in 1993, and it was in L.A., and it was a former, in this case, they did elect a Republican mayor. At that time, L.A. still had enough Republicans. It's not considered, but in some ways, Caruso is this same type of candidate. You know, then Dick Reardon ran as a very moderate Republican. These days, most moderate Republicans have become moderate Democrats, if you will. So in some ways, Caruso is sort of the same thing. And we've seen L.A. do this before. We've seen cities do this before. And I do think it's a little bit of a warning shot to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Because in some of these bigger blue cities, progressives have gotten a lot of shots here, and they're taking the brunt of this. If you will, and I think that's the story, the longer-term story and the longer-term hit, is that can the progressives govern? Progressives can win some of these elections, but can they govern? Right now, the message in San Francisco is no.
Chuck, I'm being told that Rick, can you stand by for 1 second? I know you probably got to run, but hang tight for a sec, because I think Steve has Rick Caruso. Oh, just kidding. It's just live pictures, not an interview yet. So, Chuck, let me chat with you while we're waiting for this interview to happen. And if it doesn't happen the next minute, we'll break out. But it's not just California. There's an interesting primary in Iowa, a Democratic primary for Senate there. A former Democratic Congresswoman trying to go up against Chuck Grassley, trying to be able to do that. And Senator Grassley is, obviously, we know who he is, right? A top Republican over in the Senate. What are the chances here, given that Iowa, as you well know, less purple, more red these days?
Well, look, Democrats spent a lot of money.
Start to speak. Here's Rick Caruso.
Yeah, I see him there.
I'm sorry, pal. Stand by for 1 sec. Let's listen in.
What's that? Okay.
Hallie, if you can hear me, we're still within that 100 feet, so we cannot actually talk to Rick Caruso right now. He's just shaking hands. He'll be heading in to vote, obviously, and we'll see. It's past a fence, Hallie, so he's got to come back out. He's got to vote, and then we have to go into a park where he's scheduled to speak to us. After that, I imagine it'll probably be another 10 minutes or so. So don't wait up for me.
You're like the friend at dinner who's just like running really late, and should we order the appetizers or not? I don't know. So Chuck, let me go back to you and talk to me about Iowa here and what you see there, because Senator Grassley is somebody who I think is a name who's familiar to many of our viewers, somebody who's assumed power in the Senate on the Republican side. It seems like it's an uphill fight, no?
Oh, it is. But look, even though 7 states are voting, the fact is the only statewide race of note is this one in the 7 states, to be frank, which is why maybe we're elevating it a little bit. Look, Iowa is not deep red. It is light red. Iowa is a state where an average Democrat can still get 45, a little bit harder to get to the 50% mark. But what's interesting about the Democratic primary is there's a couple of cross currents that we've been paying attention to nationally. So Abby Finkenauer is part of that class of 18 of House Democrats that won red districts. They flipped Trump districts. Connor Lamb was the most famous member of that class. He ran for the Senate about a month ago and lost to somebody that was sort of more of an outsider, in this case to his left, in John Fetterman. Mike Franken is a retired admiral, really has only been back in the state after retirement for a few years. He ran for the Senate and lost a primary. Sound familiar? John Fetterman ran and lost a primary. But he's the, quote, outsider because he hasn't held elective office. And Connor Lamb was no longer an outsider. He was Congressman Lamb. And Abby Finkenauer is not an outsider. She's Congresswoman Finkenauer, even though she's now a former member. But point is, that's a dynamic I'm curious about. We're seeing all this sort of anti-Washington, anti-politician fervor out there. And when voters have been given a choice, left or right, when they think one is an insider and one is an outsider, they're leaning outsider, right? We're seeing this whether it's D or R. Yeah.
Chuck Todd, great to see you. Thank you for getting in the weeds with us a little bit tonight here at 5 p.m. Appreciate it, 5 and 6. If you have not made your voting plan yet, by the way, take a quick scan of the QR code on your screen right now. Screenshot it, come up and snap a picture, whatever's easiest. It takes you to NBC's Plan Your Vote site so you can get information on races and specific voting rules for where you live. So turning now to another of the biggest issues on the minds of voters and a big reminder for all of us on the higher cost of living today. Gas prices hitting yet another high, $4.92 a gallon. That's like $2 more than just a year ago. Analysts say we're getting ready to cross the $5 mark sometime between now and Father's Day in a couple weeks. In 13 states, though, and here in Washington, D.C., we are already seeing those $5 averages. Some other states are within just pennies of it. Analysts say it's not just because of sanctions on Russia, but it's all of us doing all of that traveling when school lets out for the summer, which these companies know increases demand. They think prices could hit, brace yourselves, $6 a gallon by Labor Day. And it's not just gas prices, it's inflation that makes a whole lot more cost more. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was at Capitol Hill today, acknowledging, she says, that she and the Fed chair should not have called inflation transitory and saying the current rates are not acceptable. Watch.
As Chair Powell indicated himself, both of us probably could have used a better term than transitory. There's no question that we have huge inflation pressures, although I very much hope that it will be coming down now.
All of it's coming just ahead of this month's report on inflation. Zincle Asimov is joining us now from Brooklyn to talk about all of this. And start with those gas prices, right? And who drivers are pointing the finger at here?
Yeah, Hallie, so I've been talking with drivers all afternoon, and while they have different sentiments on who or what to blame for the high gas prices, one thing they can agree on is that the cost is way too high. I heard you talk about the prices in D.C. Here in New York, according to AAA, every single borough has exceeded $5. That's evidenced right here in Brooklyn. You can see the cost of unleaded regular gas is $5.09. We can see that around Brooklyn today, and people are upset. Here's what some of them had to say about who they're blaming for this.
I think the war in Ukraine certainly impacting gas prices. There's supply chain issues from COVID all over the world still. International transportation costs are high. So I just think it's the perfect storm of all these things.
I think it's a lot easier to go out and blame somebody else than it is to put in the hard work.
But the thing is, Hallie, it's not just in New York. 8 states alone saw an increase of at least 10 cents or more in the price of gas per gallon. And just next door in New Jersey, they set an unfortunate record exceeding or hitting $5 per gallon. So people are feeling the pain at the pump, Hallie.
And it's not just gas, right? You heard it there. We just played it. The Treasury Secretary acknowledging to lawmakers they got it wrong on inflation, right? She's also saying she hopes it's going to come down. That is critical, I think, to a lot of Americans around the country. And it frankly is the focus of the White House at this moment in time, spending much of this month really intensively looking at the economy, the economic picture, and ways for people to find relief, especially because the unemployment rate is low. There are other signs of a strong economy.
Yeah, absolutely, Hallie. And look, this is what the Biden administration is doing. Biden announced a plan to release 1 million barrels of oil a day from strategic oil reserves. That's an effort to increase access to oil. They're also trying to partner with Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Iran, all with the hopes of increasing supply and decreasing costs. At the end of the day, though, there's a lot of competing forces. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now we're seeing hurricane season, so it will likely be some time before drivers feel the relief at the pump. Hallie?
Cincle Esma, good to see you out there in New York. Appreciate it. The high price of gas, a lot of people might be choosing to fly instead for their summer vacation, but there may be some turbulence there as well. Do you see what we did there? It's a pun. We did a pun with the word turbulence. It's because the airlines are grounding planes with this travel season in what they say is a pilot shortage. But here's the thing. The Airline Pilots Association is coming out this afternoon saying, wait a second, there are plenty of pilots. They say the airlines are blaming a shortage that doesn't exist so they can cancel flights and make more money. They also say the airlines are trying to use this as an excuse to weaken safety rules. Bottom line is this, right? There are fewer flights available for you at the airport today. American Airlines says it's going to ground 100 regional planes because it doesn't have the pilots to fly them. They're actually looking to fill 2,000 pilot jobs right now. Delta and JetBlue also adjusting their schedules. And United announced a few months back in December it's taking some regional planes out of service because of a shortage. Leslie Joseph is joining us now with more on this story. I'm glad to have you on, Leslie, because I know that this is a beat you know well. So what's up? Is there a pilot shortage? Is there not a pilot shortage?
I guess it does depend who you ask. Like you said, the Airline Pilots Association, the largest pilots union in America, says that airlines are cutting flights, service to cities, mainly to drive up profits, drive up fares in the process. We have to back up a little bit and understand kind of what happened in COVID, which really ignited this whole problem. So airlines, they were losing money. They had record losses in 2020, $35 billion. And one thing that they did to stop the bleeding was to encourage as many pilots as possible to take buyouts. And that included a lot of senior pilots that were making a lot of money. And a lot of the offers were very attractive. Plenty of pilots took them up on that. And then they also were not flying a lot. The airlines had cut capacity enormously during the pandemic. And then fast forward to 2021 when demand starts to snap back. And here we are in 2022 when I think a lot of us have been in the airport recently and seen packed planes. And the staffing is not there to match what the demand is. And airlines are looking for places where they can hire pilots, and a big place where they can do that is the regional airlines. And those are the smaller planes that many of us are used to flying when we go to smaller cities, and those end up being the cities that tend to suffer either from fewer frequencies or outright service cuts.
So when might there be a solution, right? Because with this shortage, it's not like you snap your fingers and you can suddenly have 7,000 new pilots right away.
It takes months, and pilots in the United States need 1,500 hours to be able to fly for an airline, so it's not anything that can have a quick fix. They also need to retire by age 65. There is some talk about raising that age, but it has not happened yet.
Leslie, thank you. Good to see you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
A Capitol police officer who was one of the first to be hurt while trying to hold back that pro-Trump mob trying to storm the Capitol. We've now learned that she will testify at the first hearing of the committee on Thursday night. We're talking about Carolyn Edwards, who got a concussion when she cracked her head on the steps outside the Capitol after being knocked to the ground by rioters pushing back a barricade. This is her. She was talking with Garrett Haake a few months back about something else, therapy dogs, actually, and how they've helped her heal. We also expect to hear from a documentary filmmaker Thursday who was following the far-right militia group, the Proud Boys, as the riot started. We mentioned Garrett Haake, so let's bring him in now. And let's start with Carolyn Edwards and this testimony and why this matters in the picture that this committee is going to try to paint in this, by the way, high-profile primetime hearing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the committee sees this hearing on Thursday night as their opening argument, and it's also an introduction to the story that maybe folks who are watching this show are quite familiar with, but the committee hopes their audience will include a lot of people who haven't been paying attention to the day-to-day, drip, drip, drip of the January 6th investigatory story, and they want to grab those people's attention, and they want to hold it. And so Officer Edwards is a part of that. As you mentioned, she got a concussion during that day, and then, by the way, went right back to work. I mean, she was there for hours on that day trying to evacuate lawmakers from the building, hold back rioters as they were trying to push inside of it. She was only returned to duty this spring after so much of a recovery period just to get back up to snuff. She's going to be able to go into the hearing room and tell her story and put a human face on the violence that day. That's just kind of the predicate for the story that the committee will then tell about what they believe to be this far-reaching conspiracy well up into the Trump White House. But it takes someone who could be a sympathetic kind of opening portion of that story, and that's what they hope to get from Officer Edwards.
The committee's also reportedly interviewed the head of the detail, the Trump detail, who used to be basically at the former president's shoulder as part of the Secret Service on the day of the attack. What else do we know about that?
Well, we know they've interviewed quite a few Secret Service agents, in fact. The Secret Service giving us a statement saying that any agent who has been asked to testify by the committee has done so. And the committee has a bunch of things that they could potentially learn from these agents, both from the ones who would have been protecting then-President Trump on that day about the rally at the Ellipse and plans that might have been put in place or canceled or discussed to move him to the Capitol. Remember, so many of the rioters on that day told reporters after the fact they thought President Trump was coming with them. So the Secret Service can talk about that and how then President Trump spent the rest of his day. But remember, it's also Vice President Pence who is protected by Secret Service agents. They were in the building with him and might be able to talk about the specific threats he faced on that day. The pressure campaign on Pence is expected to be the focus of one of these hearings a little later on. I wouldn't be surprised to hear from Secret Service agents on that day as well, Hallie.
Garrett Haake, live for us on the Hill. Garrett, good to see you. Thank you. And a reminder, we will have special coverage of that primetime January 6th hearing and the other hearings right here on NBC News Now. First one, of course, 8 o'clock Eastern on Thursday. Coming up, we'll take you back to L.A. Listen, we promised you that interview with Rick Caruso. We'll give it to you. Plus, the woman you just saw, originally from Kansas, pleading guilty and admitting she led an all-female battalion for ISIS. How much time she could get for her time spent in Syria. Plus, why Paramount is being sued over Top Gun. That's one of our 5 things. Stay with us. The Ukrainian government today says more than 40,000 people there, civilians, innocent people, have either been killed or hurt since the invasion by Russia first started. And the government says that for 3 million Ukrainians who did survive the fighting, they're now living in Ukraine in places controlled by Russia, and that Russia wants to expand that territory, especially in the east. Today, the Russian Defense Ministry says they now hold 97% of territory in the east, called Luhansk. They say they've, quote, liberated it, their words, right, after weeks of fighting very intensely. As for Ukraine, they're not letting go of one key eastern city, Severodonetsk. Russia's surrounded it from 3 sides, and it's become such a close fight that the mayor there says the situation on the ground is changing basically every hour. To some other news now. A Kansas woman who led an all-female ISIS battalion has just pled guilty to supporting terrorism. And as part of her plea deal, Allison Fluke-Ekren spoke about her role in Syria, where she rose up the ranks of ISIS, training more than 100 women and girls, including her own daughter. She says she showed them how to use AK-47s, grenades, and suicide belts. The Justice Department says she wanted to attack a shopping mall here in the U.S. She is now looking at up to 20 years in prison. Her lawyers declined to comment to NBC News today. Ken Delanian joins us now. And Ken, the U.S. had been on the hunt for her for 7 years, right? So what is the significance of her pleading guilty today? Put that into context for us.
Hallie, this is a huge win for the people in the Justice Department, the FBI, and the intelligence community who've devoted their careers in many cases to fighting terrorism. And for many of them, it's particularly important to hold accountable Americans who left their country to join terrorist organizations devoted to destroying the United States. You know, the charge of treason was not brought in this case, but what Fluke-Ekren admitted to in court today fits the common sense definition of the word. This former teacher from Kansas brought her children to live in the ISIS caliphate in Syria, where her husband was a sniper while she played a leadership role among women in the terror group. And prosecutors say she planned terrorist attacks at an unnamed college in this country, and that her plans were approved by the emir of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. One witness told investigators she discussed planting a car bomb in an American shopping mall, and she said that any attack that didn't kill a lot of people was a waste of resources. Now, thankfully, ISIS wasn't able to pull off those attacks, but Fluke Ekran also allegedly trained young children in Syria to use machine guns and suicide belts. Another new fact that emerged today is that prosecutors say she was present after the 2011 attacks on the American compound in Benghazi, Libya, that killed the U.S. ambassador and 3 others. Prosecutors say her husband removed some documents that she then helped review, and they both provided them to the terrorist group that attacked the compound. That's a long way from teaching school in Kansas, Hallie.
Researchers, it sure is, Ken, who look at extremism, I know, say that hundreds of Western women support ISIS or have joined up. Do we have a clearer sense of how common this is specifically?
Yeah, it's actually fairly common. At the height of the movement in 2018, one British researcher estimated that nearly 5,000 Western women and 4,000 children had gone to live in the now defunct ISIS caliphate. And right now, there's a detention camp in northeastern Syria where hundreds of Western women and children who joined ISIS are waiting to go home, including Canadians and Western Europeans. And in many cases, their countries do not want them back. A lot of them have talked about being taken in by propaganda and being groomed by male ISIS figures online. Fluke Ekran stands out, though, because prosecutors say she actually trained an all-female battalion of fighters. And one witness told authorities that they were proud to have an American instructor. Hallie.
Ken Delanian, thank you very much for that reporting. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Army says the military is investigating whether an American service member was behind an attack at a base in Syria back in April. The military says 4 troops were hurt after explosives were put inside the base and went off. Nobody's been charged yet. Number 2, a bipartisan pair of senators, New York Democrat Kirsten Gillibrand and Wyoming Republican Cynthia Lummis, introduced a bill to create new rules for crypto. It would basically define the blockchain and digital asset industries for the first time and assign a regulatory agency to oversee them. So trying to put some boundaries on the cryptocurrency craze. Number 3, the International Skating Union has voted to gradually raise the minimum skating competition age from 15 to 17 years old. The decision came after Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva tested positive for a banned substance at this year's Olympics in Beijing. Number 4, speaking of China, high school seniors all across that country started their college entrance exams today. And as if that wasn't hard enough, some of them have also reportedly been locked down at school for more than a month already. That's because of China's zero COVID policy to try to avoid an outbreak. You have to go through a temperature check, masks, negative PCR tests to take the exam on site. Number 5, the family of the author whose article inspired the first Top Gun is suing Paramount for copyright infringement. They're saying Paramount didn't reacquire the rights to the piece called Top Guns. It's not clear how much in damages the family wants, but the profits from Maverick are huge so far, like more than $550 million globally. Johnny Depp just joined TikTok, and he's now already posting his first video thanking fans for their support during his defamation trial against his ex-wife Amber Heard. Last week, a jury unanimously found Heard defamed Depp when she wrote an op-ed about being a victim of domestic violence for the Washington Post, while never naming Depp specifically. They also found one of Depp's lawyers had defamed Heard. I know you probably remember, because we talked about it and covered it, Depp got a lot of social media support in the trial, including a video. He included a video that showed his supporters cheering him as he headed to the courthouse in Virginia. In this TikTok video, he thanked his fans for their backing and said it's time to move forward together. Still to come. They're part of a group none of them ever wanted to be in. None of them ever pictured themselves being in. School leaders who have experienced gun violence, stepping in to help other educators after horrific incidents. That's our original tonight. My interview with the principal at Columbine, coming up. A notable absence today from an emergency meeting of the Uvalde City Council in Texas. Police Chief Pete Arredondo. He's the one who oversaw that heavily criticized response to the massacre in Uvalde 2 weeks ago. He wasn't there. He's a member of the City Council, believed to have been sworn in just recently. Uvalde's mayor says he doesn't know why Arredondo wasn't there, and the chief could not be immediately reached for comment. It's coming as there are more memorials today for some of the 19 children killed. A funeral for 10-year-old Javier James Lopez, an active little kid who loved playing basketball. And there was a visitation for 10-year-old Annabelle Guadalupe Rodriguez. She loved the color blue, especially on butterflies, and she loved spending time with her sister and family. Arnulfo Reyes, a teacher at Robb Elementary who survived, who lost all 11 of the students in his classroom. their lives stolen by the gunman. For the first time ever, he is talking about what happened on that horrific day, speaking to Good Morning America on ABC News and blaming the slow police response for their deaths. Listen.
You have a bulletproof vest. I had nothing. I had nothing. You're supposed to protect and serve. There is no excuse for their actions, and I will never forgive them.
Reyes added he wants to make sure this never happens again. He says he will not let these kids and his coworkers die in vain. That brings us to tonight's original, in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And it is this issue of gun violence in schools. It has been 2 weeks since that massacre at Robb Elementary. And since then, there's been that city council meeting we talked about, memorials for the people who were killed. But what about the school itself, right? How does a school move on, even next school year, after a mass shooting? One group is working overtime now to help schools like Robb Elementary move forward. Our team talking with principals of schools bonded by horrific violence. And we asked them, is it even possible to recover?
When former Columbine principal Frank DeAngelis heard about the massacre in Uvalde, he picked up the phone and left a voicemail for the principal of Robb Elementary.
I guess I was pretty naive back in April of '99. I made the comment within 24 hours. I said, I hope my beloved 13 do not die in vain, and that this does not happen again. And unfortunately, it continues to happen.
It's part of his work with the Principal Recovery Network, a group he helped found of school leaders who experience gun violence. They offer help right away and support to principals who lead schools that have encountered shootings.
Why do you think the Principal Recovery Network helps and is useful in a moment like this?
Well, I think a lot of times one of the things that was kind of a trigger for many of us is principals or teachers stating that I know what you're feeling, and you're trying to say, do you really? Were you stuck in a classroom? Did you encounter a gunman?
More than 311,000 students have been exposed to gun violence during school hours since Columbine happened, according to the Washington Post. And now the Uvalde shooting has spurred the network to write an open letter to elected officials saying, we beg you, do something, do anything. But without policy changes, more schools are being forced to figure out themselves how to, for example, reopen after a shooting.
Really, we have to kind of let them take the lead in talking about it. So it is appropriate to ask questions. How are you feeling? Are you feeling okay? Are you feeling safe?
That's maybe the biggest challenge to recovery.
How do you get students to feel safe in school again after they've experienced something as horrific as a mass shooting? Is that even possible?
Well, it is difficult. And one of the things that I learned is afterwards, you want the kids to feel safe. You want the parents to make sure that they feel safe having the kids there. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you do not have things in your building that are triggering the emotion and anxiety.
For the students at Columbine, that meant, for example, changing the sound of the fire alarm and choosing to stop serving Chinese food in the cafeteria because that's what they had for lunch the day the shooting happened. But it's different for each school, and there's no blueprint for recovery.
There are a lot of decisions that had to be made in that moment. What to do with the space, how to move forward with the school culture.
Elizabeth Brown became the principal of Forest High School in Ocala, Florida in 2018. Just 45 days after a student who'd been expelled hurt a classmate with a sawed-off shotgun before it jammed. She and Greg Johnson are also members of the network. He's the principal of West Liberty-Salem High School in Ohio, where he convinced a gunman to drop his weapon after shooting a student at school back in 2017.
If you look at fully recovered, meaning you're going back to the way it was before, no, I don't think that's possible. But you do get your feet back under you, maybe as a school and as a community, and you reestablish that new normal.
These principals, brought together by the trauma of leading through horrific circumstances, also had practical matters to deal with. What to do on the first anniversary of a shooting, or how to approach graduation.
We hate to add new members to the group. We just don't want this to happen to any other principal.
In a sign of the times, with gun violence threatening schools across the country, the network is set to release a guide for other principals. It'll be out later this summer, ahead of the next school year.
Unfortunately, we've seen over the past few decades, it could happen in any communities, large communities, small communities, rural communities, and we just need to be there to support.
a club that no principal ever wants to find themselves in. We told you at the top of that story that DeAngelis had left a message for the principal of Robb. They haven't been in contact yet, but DeAngelis says that's really normal, that typically in these instances, principals try to get through the memorial services, et cetera, before then turning to think about the bigger picture. It is, again, an awful sign of the times that is the reality that some of these educators face. Coming up here on the show, Kevin Spacey facing sex assault charges in the UK, and now a New York judge says the star, or former star, has to stand trial for a civil sex abuse suit, why the case is being allowed to move forward. Plus, what went wrong on Mount Shasta in California that led to the death of a climbing guide and several other rescues. That's next in The Local. NBC covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our West Coast Bureau, a climbing guide has died. Several others were hurt in some separate incidents on Mount Shasta in Northern California. Officials say the guide was tethered to a couple that she was bringing up the mountain when one of them lost their footing, so they all fell. Other climbers say they were facing some pretty tough conditions after fresh snow turned to ice. From our Southeast Bureau, if you visit the U.S. Botanic Garden here in D.C., you might want to double up on face masks. That's because the infamous corpse flower is blooming. It is 8 feet tall. It's pretty extraordinarily rare. And it's known for its very powerful and very stinky smell. Let's be real about it. It's gross. It does not smell good. It smells like rotting flesh. So I don't know. If you feel like going to the Botanic Garden, get psyched for that. Also from our Southeast Bureau, the Carolina Panthers have hired the NFL's first openly transgender cheerleader. Justine Lindsay is one of the Top Cat's newest members. She posted on Instagram this picture with the news of her new gig. To some other news out of New York now, where a judge has decided Kevin Spacey has to face trial on a civil suit accusing him of sexually abusing actor Anthony Rapp in the 80s when Rapp was just 14 years old. Spacey tried to get the suit dismissed, but the judge said no, because there's a real question as to whether Spacey forcibly touched Rapp when the two were in Spacey's home in Manhattan at the time. Spacey denied those claims when they first came out, but this was really the first allegation against him that derailed his career. After Rapp spoke out, you may remember, dozens of other accusers also came forward. It comes as Spacey's also facing criminal charges for sex assault in the UK. Isa Gutierrez joins us now. And Isa, Spacey tried to get this suit dismissed, but this judge said no. So does that mean it's going to trial? And what might we expect to see there?
Yeah, it is, Hallie. So this district judge here in Manhattan ruled that Rapp's claims of battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress against Spacey will be moving forward into trial. So according to court documents, that trial has actually already been set for October 4th. They're expecting for the trial to last about 2 weeks or less. After the judge made this decision, the court documents state that both parties requested that this case be heard in front of a jury. We did learn a little bit more based on these court proceedings this week, what we might hear at that trial. So the judge writes, quote, Mr. Rapp claims that Mr. Fowler, that's Kevin Spacey, lifted him up, that Mr. Fowler's hand grazed Mr. Rapp's clothed buttocks for seconds as he did so, that Mr. Fowler placed Mr. Rapp back down on a bed, and Mr. Fowler then briefly placed his own clothed body partially beside and partially across Mr. Rapp's, end quote. Now, Rapp claims that this alleged incident occurred in a bedroom at Spacey's apartment back in the late 80s, like you mentioned, during a party. However, in these same court documents, Spacey says that these allegations are entirely false. In fact, he says that Rapp didn't attend a party at this apartment and that there was no bedroom in the apartment in the first place. Hallie?
What is Rapp, essentially, what else do we know about what Rapp wants to get out of this trial?
Sure. So he is asking for punitive damages for Spacey to be punished in some way. We won't know until or unless he is found guilty by the jury what exactly that would look like. But he's also asking for compensatory damages, saying that he endured psychological injuries as a result of this alleged incident. He also, in his deposition, did say that there was no kissing, no undressing, no reaching under clothes, and no sexualized statements or innuendo. He acknowledges that the entire incident took no more than 2 minutes. Now, he did originally also claim assault, but the judge said that that claim would not move forward. It would just be the battery and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. And Hallie, we did reach out to both Rapp and Spacey today and did not hear back.
Isa Gutierrez, thanks so much. When we come back, an FDA panel just recommending authorizing another COVID vaccine. We'll tell you what's different about this one and why some experts say we might need it. Coming up. So we told you about that high-profile L.A. mayoral race with voters heading to the ballot today to vote in the Democratic primary there. You heard from Congresswoman Karen Bass. We had been thinking maybe we'd hear live from Rick Caruso, her opponent here. Well, sure enough, Steve Patterson did grab him for a quick interview, telling Steve that Caruso feels good about his chances in the primary. He says his number one priority is to solve the homelessness crisis and to get encampments off the streets. He also responded to what Congresswoman Bass said earlier regarding his spending in the campaign. Listen up.
I think we should talk about track record, and I think we should look at her voting record, and we should talk about what has she done in the last 20 years in office to cure homelessness, remove encampments. What has she done to reduce crime? Did she carry one bill in Congress other than renaming a post office? And today in the Wall Street Journal, you know, she's got a quote. Her quote is, under her leadership, it will take 4 years. Even in 4 years, homelessness won't end, but maybe there'll be a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that's what everybody's fed up with.
We'll have more on the results of that race and the others, with 7 states voting in primaries today, of course, as the evening continues, and tomorrow, too. To the pandemic now. An FDA committee just voting to recommend Novavax's COVID vaccine for use in the U.S. This is for adults. So the FDA next has to decide whether to authorize the shot for emergency use, and then the CDC would sign off. So remember, it was committee, then it's full FDA, then it's CDC. This is interesting because the vaccine uses a protein technology that's different from what Pfizer and Moderna use with their mRNA shots. This is more of like a traditional vaccine formulation. And with about a third of Americans still unvaccinated, Novavax hopes maybe this will convince some of them to get the shot. Meg Terrell from CNBC is joining us now. So, Meg, what do we need to know about this vaccine? The differences from this Novavax protein technology versus the mRNA technology in Moderna and Pfizer?
Yeah, so essentially, Novavax uses a tried and true technology, as you were just noting. It's used in one of the flu vaccines, in the shingles vaccine, the hepatitis vaccine. This is a protein-based vaccine where essentially it delivers the spike protein from the coronavirus to the body to train the immune system to recognize it and being able to mount an immune response when it encounters it again in nature. The mRNA vaccines deliver the genetic instructions for our own cells to make the spike protein and then go through that entire process. And so there was some discussion today from the FDA. Will this convince the 27 million American adults who have not yet had any COVID vaccine potentially to get one? There was some skepticism from the advisors. I spoke with Paul Offit from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia after the vote. He said he didn't exactly think it was going to bring over a ton of people, but there is a potential role for an additional technology. There's going to be boosts, kids vaccines, lots of potential ways to optimize and figure out the best vaccine, for different people, and they might not all be the same ones.
When the pandemic started back in 2020, Novavax had 100 employees, could barely manufacture, had almost very little capacity for that. Where do things stand now? A little bit different, huh?
It's quite different. Yeah, I actually just spoke with Novavax's CEO after the vote as well, Stan Erck. He just said it is a moment for this sort of deep letting go of a breath. They've been working on this for so long. They had a huge setback in the years leading up to the pandemic. And from a business perspective, their stock was down to something like $4. Now it's above $50. They were really on the brink. But that's also why it took them so long to get to this point. They had no manufacturing capacity. They had to build all of that up and then get it cleared by the FDA. So they're way behind the leading players, but now finally getting caught up, potentially heading toward their first approval. It's a big turnaround for a U.S.-based company.
Do you think there's any, any credibility to this idea that perhaps unvaccinated Americans, people who are not vaccinated, might take the Novavax vaccine because it is a more traditional formulation versus the Pfizer or Moderna? Or, Meg, in what you've seen from public polling, et cetera, are people so sort of hardened in their positions now, either vax or no vax, that this may not make much of a difference? I know that's a bit of a speculative question, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on this as somebody who covers this every day.
Yeah, we haven't seen good data, suggesting that there are a ton of people who are just waiting for a more traditional vaccine type to go out and get vaccinated. On the margins, it might make some difference for some folks. One of the people on the committee is an allergist, and he said if people have hypersensitive reactions to one of the mRNA vaccines, he'd be happy to have this as an option for them. But Paul Offit compared it to people waiting for full approval of the mRNA vaccines, thinking that would make some big difference. It really didn't, and this might not for those folks who haven't gotten vaccinated yet either.
Meg Terrell, good to see you. Thank you. And good to see all of you, too, for this hour. That's a wrap for now, but we'll have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.